going into a sprint, we sometimes want to make sure that we're actually working on the right challenge, so that we're clear on what it is that we're actually going to be, solving for, what it is that we're going to be building. And that's why problem framing can be very helpful. It can be a very powerful technique. So usually the problem framing will happen before you go into a sprint. And what we're looking at is we're trying to understand, okay, what's the business context? So if this is for a business or an organization, what's the need? What do they have? What's the value that they're trying to achieve? What are the issues that they're seeing, for example? So what's the impact of what's going on to their business? But then we're also trying to understand from a user's perspective, what's happening with maybe some of the key stakeholders. So the primary, let's say, actors or the primary people involved. So what are some of the pains or the gains that they're having as well? And then really we're trying to kind of figure out like that sweet spot between the two. So this is what the business is trying to achieve. Here's kind of the problems that the users have. And then ultimately this feeds into our challenge statement that works really well for us to bring into a design sprint. And so it allows us to go a little bit deeper in making sure that we have a better understanding of the problem, so that our day one is a lot smoother, a lot easier, especially if you're using some of the compressed design sprint format. So we had the 5 days, then we had the 4 days with AJ and Smart. So we already have a lot of pressure to kind of compress that design sprint method. And so in this way, making sure that you spend a little bit of time upfront, this will also help you to understand, who you should be bringing into the sprint. So who are some of the key players that would help you in order to solve this particular problem. So that's also another great aspect of running this type of workshop beforehand. So the problem framing workshop really kind of frames up the overall challenge and helps the team get clear on what they're actually going to be doing within the sprint. And then the sprint itself allows us to now be able to work on focusing on that problem and testing some ideas and getting some qualitative data or some research to understand if we're on the right track. And then a lot of times, perhaps after that design sprint, you might go into an iteration sprint where you've taken the feedback that you got from real people, and now you're making some adjustments to the prototype. And in some cases, teams might actually start developing requirements based off that. So it starts to kind of feed into your other sprints that you might have from an execution perspective. So you might build out some story maps or some user stories, for example, and then really start to kind of execute on the project. So that's kind of how maybe some of these different workshops have fallen into place. This is how we've used it in the past, and it's been really powerful to help teams kind of get off on the right foot, especially when they're launching or kicking off large projects. Like any good framework, you want to make sure that, or any good workshop, you want to make sure that people are clear on what's the objective, what are the topics that they're going to cover, what are some of the norms and the agreements for the workshop. So making sure everybody understands, the roles and responsibilities. So the facilitator, the decider, for example, so who can help make the ultimate decision. So those are just, some standard stuff that you want to make sure is present, at the beginning of your workshop, so that people are clear on what the rules of the engagement are. I'm just going to move over to the mural here that we've set up for our example problem framing workshop. So this is a mini workshop. So again, problem framing is helping us to kind of understand, define, and really prioritize what the business challenge is that we want to bring into our sprint. Ultimately, that's going to help us ensure that we're making a better decision, so that we're working on the right problem, so that we've got the ideas that we want to test. Now, in terms of the steps that we would take, so you'll see that I've got like step 1, step 2, step 3, and there's going to be a series of steps. Some of them are focusing on the business, some of them are focusing on the customer. So if we look at the top one for now, so if we start at kind of like step 1, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll get your stakeholders in a room, and you might have some different representation of key stakeholders. So these are people that have, let's say, a high interest, obviously, in the challenge, and potentially also have a lot of authority or a lot of power as well. So these are people that can be actively involved in making sure that we're clear on what we need to work on. And so they'll typically express what kind of need the business is having. So in our case, let's say we're dealing with, maybe we've got to we've got challenges with the traveler experience at an airport, for example. And so you've got the airport authority, you're working with the airport, and you're trying to improve the overall traveler experience. And so they might say something like the need is to, something like that, like to just improve the traveler experience because they're getting, poor reviews. Travelers are leaving a lot of complaints, and they're really dissatisfied with the overall experience that's happening at the airport. And so a lot of times what you'll do is you'll kind of brainstorm with these stakeholders in terms of, okay, what's the challenge? What's the need that you're seeing? And that kind of will be, let's say, the first quick activity that you want to run. So I'm putting aside, obviously, any kind of warm-ups that you do in terms of getting them familiar with Mural or getting them familiar with the visual and the collaboration tools that we're using. If we're just looking at, the problem framing activities and exercises themselves. The other one that's helpful is looking at what they've tried to do in the past to solve this problem. So, brainstorming like what's worked, what really well. So things that they've done, perhaps things that they've done that haven't gone so well. So this is more of just building on some key learnings. So things that they've tried and understanding like, why did it work? Or things that they tried that didn't work, why didn't it work? And again, just visually getting everybody to share kind of what they know in terms of either solutions or things that we've tried in the past, what worked well, what didn't work well. And that can be very helpful for context setting, for just realizing, okay, that we're not going to reinvent the wheel, but we can perhaps leverage some of the key learnings. The other thing that's helpful kind of in the next step is to figure out, well, where do we want to go, right? So what would good look like? What would success look like 6 months from now or 2 years from now? Now, we do this type of activity inside of day one of the design sprint. So, the design sprint itself has some problem framing techniques, especially on day one. But what we're doing here is we're just extending that a little bit so that we actually come more prepared going into that design sprint. And so we're really trying to understand, okay, so again, what does good look like? How could we potentially measure good in terms of the business? So in here, they might say something like, the reviews have improved 2 years from now. Our revenue is up as well. So we don't necessarily have, travelers, skipping our airport because they don't like the experience, for example. And that actually, so one is just kind of setting that vision in terms of what are we actually trying to achieve. And then also kind of understanding, well, what's the impact of failure? So if we don't do this, if we don't address this, what is the issue that we'll have? And so some of those issues around things like revenue, for example, or customer satisfaction, that could come up. So they can say, okay, we're seeing a lot of people, that are, the flow or the traffic coming into our airport is on the decline, for example. So people aren't necessarily coming to our airport, they're skipping over it, or they're going to another airport. So you're just trying to feel like, what is the pain? What are the actual issues that are affecting their business as a result of not being able to address this need that they have? And so in a lot of ways, we've kind of focused a little bit on the business value, but just really trying to kind of narrow in on what the real problem is for the business, the pain that they're feeling, the impact that it's having, where do they want to go? And then the next step is looking at that customer value. So looking at the users, the stakeholders, the primary actors. And so here, we start off with like, okay, well, so who are the primary actors? So who benefits, let's say, from us solving this particular problem? And so, of course, you might have travelers, you'll get more specific. So they could be, let's say, business travelers, for example. And now what we want to do is kind of dig into that a little bit as well. So thinking about, business travelers. So in our case, we're thinking, okay, well, what's the opportunity or what's the actual problem here? So we have the classic like who, what, where, why. And so if you're thinking about building a problem statement for a particular stakeholder, we can look at, okay, perhaps the business traveler, let's say the problem is that they have a problem getting rest and relaxation. And then we think about like where's the context for this problem, where it's perhaps when they're waiting at an airport lounge in between connecting flights. Like let's say they're in a long distance flight from Toronto to Hong Kong, and they've got a layover in London. And they've got a really important meeting the next day. So, an ideal solution would allow them to feel less exhausted, more alert for their business meeting. So they're more refreshed, for example. So we're trying to figure out, okay, like, who's who's the actor, what's the pain, where is this occurring, why is it a pain for them, like what would be an ideal solution, and then from a business value perspective, if we solve this for them, what does this do for the business? So you're kind of having that customer value, but also that business value. And even from a business value perspective, this can be quite helpful, especially as it links back to your overall strategy as an organization. So if your strategy is to, let's say, grow revenue or to reduce costs or to improve customer satisfaction, then by creating some of these problem statements and then seeing how they actually impact the business value, you'll be able to actually prioritize them as well in terms of which ones perhaps make the most sense based on the need that we're actually discussing right now. A lot of times you may even go further and kind of create a journey map. So we've done that before, where we've created a lightweight journey map, even going into the sprint. So that can be helpful. It can save you a lot of time in the sprint, so that you don't have to dedicate a lot of time, let's say, to the mapping exercise, especially if you're dealing with something quite complex and you're trying to get a better understanding of it. That can be quite helpful. So that could be something else that you do, is just kind of map this overall journey. So if we're talking about a business traveler, like what does that current state look like today? Even though we've kind of outlined it here in terms of this problem statement, what are those steps that they're going through and which ones are the most problematic, let's say. And then ultimately, what does success look like for this user, these stakeholders? So if we're looking at measuring their success and we can see that it's working, what would that actually look like? So these different activities are helpful in understanding and framing up the challenge going into a sprint. And sometimes what you can do is you can then create kind of what's called a challenge statement. So something like an ad lib statement that you can use that can be helpful, so that when you're going into the sprint, everybody's clear on what you're trying to solve for. The one that I like actually is created by Lean UX. So this is Jeff Godhealth and Josh Snyder. And I think the one that they have is pretty good. So, our product or service or process, so whatever you're working on, whether it's a product or a service or process, let's say it's like an HR onboarding process, for example, it was designed to achieve, very specific goals. So, these activities that we're trying to do is figure out what are those goals? What are we actually trying to achieve? And then we've observed that, maybe it's not meeting these goals right now, right? So our customer satisfaction is really low, or our revenue has stalled, for example. And then which ultimately is having these adverse impact on our business, right? So what are those issues that it's having on the business? And then ultimately you kind of have this how might we statement. So how might we improve this product or service so that our customers are more successful as measured by these results, right? So what are those, either those customer behaviors, for example, or what are the results that will actually indicate that you're achieving customer success? So having this covered off becomes a lot easier when you're going into the sprint, because when you're going into the sprint, at this point that, okay, we've got a product or a service or a process that we're trying to improve. You generally have an idea of the goal that it's trying to achieve, the impact it's having on the business, and some ways to also measure, especially if you're dealing with a lot of times we're dealing with people, with customers, with a primary actor or stakeholder, and then how do we measure the job to be done for them or the results that look successful from their perspective? And so this data can be actually quite helpful going into a design sprint. And you may have multiple of these sometimes, and you might have to actually rank them and prioritize or approve them before deciding which one is the most important and which one you're going to take on. You might rewrite them in different ways to kind of look at them from different perspectives. But ultimately, once you have this, then it can be very, very helpful for the team kind of going into the sprint. Beyond that, obviously, design sprints can be powerful if you've got any data to support the research as well. So whether you're bringing in user research people at the beginning of your sprint and interviewing them to share some of that data, or you're already just coming into the sprint and you've provided some information and people have gone through that before going into the sprint. But that's going to be a lot more helpful, especially in the sprint, because then they can really, again, narrow on what are those key kind of problem areas that they want to tackle from an ideation and design perspective. I'm actually going to I'm going to stop here because I see that there's some questions, and I apologize because I think these questions. So Peter asked a question 9 minutes ago. So Peter's question: I see how problem framing would help to identify who to invite to a sprint, but who should get the invite to the problem framing workshop? And we've got Alyssa actually responded. So she probably waited, but then responded within 4 minutes and said, I usually invite the product manager, I'm assuming. They are close with customer feedback, the lead engineer, designers, and the occasion QA or marketers. But I think it really depends on the team structure. Yeah, that's a good point. And then Peter said, okay, thanks, Lisa. I suppose I'm more looking for the entry criteria for the invitees. In other words, as we consider invitees for the problem framing, what criteria do we use to decide who should attend and who should not attend? Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. So a lot of times, like if we think about the design sprint, we try and have that diverse group, right? So we've got, let's say, somebody that covers off the desirability, so the design aspect of it, somebody to cover off, let's say, the feasibility or the technical aspect of it, and then somebody to cover off the business aspect of it, so the viability. And you definitely want to have that kind of business representation, technical, and then user or design representation. And then beyond that, it's really kind of what are the skills or the subject matter expertise that will help you the most, which really depends on the challenge that you're working on. And so if you're working on, let's say, an HR problem, then you might have some subject matter experts from HR, for example. So depending on the domain, you'll have some more SMEs from that. And then, the people that you're involving, a lot of times if you kind of do that stakeholder analysis map, so you've got people that have, let's say, high interest in the outcome, and they also are quite powerful in the decision making. So they really want to collaborate with you in terms of the solutioning, and they want to collaborate versus somebody that might have some high interest, but maybe is not necessarily got any kind of authority or stake in the outcome. They might actually be somebody that you inform, that you can kind of present your findings to, whether that's after the sprint is done, for example, but you wouldn't necessarily involve. So you could do that classic kind of like, with your group to figure out like who are the people that we should be collaborating with and bringing them in, and then who are the people that just need to be informed, or maybe they need to be consulted and we bring them in as SMEs for the interviews, but they don't necessarily have to be inside the sprint. So that's another, you can kind of use that 2x2 matrix and when you're working with your project team to kind of figure out who those people are. That could be a helpful tool in terms of this kind of criteria that you're looking at, but otherwise definitely the diversity, the diversity in terms of kind of like that business, that technical, and that design are key skills definitely to have inside the sprint. And that kind of spills over to the problem framing to some degree as well. So we've done that very similar, and we've had very similar people like in the problem framing as well as in the design sprint. But anybody that's got really a good understanding of what's the main business challenge, and so a lot of times you might even have a sponsor or somebody that's maybe executive leadership kind of in the problem framing, but they might not necessarily be in the design sprint, but you still have a decider in the design sprint. So we've had that before as well. So I know that's not necessarily like an exact science, but I do find that 2x2 matrix, and I can share that out afterwards, can be helpful, and having conversations around that can be helpful. Yeah, that's right. So it's a little combo of that traditional stakeholder mapping around interest and power, and then also the desirability, feasibility, and viability. Obviously this is a very simple kind of mini workshop. You would be able to get through a workshop like this in about 6 hours. I know that sounds like a lot, but we've had to kind of, do 2 half days in order to get through this. So usually the first half day we'll get through on the business value side, so the top 4, and then the second half day we'll get through the client value. You might be able to optimize and actually get it done even sooner. But yeah, there's lots of ways to kind of, get down to what's the main opportunity or the main challenge to focus on. This is one that we've used that we found a lot of success with. For the purposes of our mock sprint, we'll probably do like a smaller, lightweight version of this, where we'll focus definitely on, the goal, let's say the issues. We'll focus on the stakeholders and the problem statements, and then we'll focus on the challenge statement. But yeah, so hopefully that we'll share the template with you guys, and we'll get a chance to run through it as a mock scenario for anyone that's going to be participating in the mock sprint. So you'll get a chance to actually go through it. Any other questions before we move on to the next part of the session?